There's a stretch of the Kestrel River bar, about a mile past the outer buoy, where the channel shifts a little more every season than any chart admits to on paper. I've been reading that stretch for 24 years, first as a deckhand on the pilot boat, then as a licensed bar pilot myself for the last 17, and I've learned that a chart tells you where the channel was surveyed, not necessarily where it is on the particular morning you're bringing a fully loaded container ship across it. My name is Elena Marsh. I'm one of 6 bar pilots licensed to bring deep draft vessels across the Kestrel River bar into the port of Alden Sound, and for the last 6 years, I've been the only one of us who carries, in a notebook that never leaves my jacket pocket, my own hand-recorded soundings of a sandbar the official charts still describe as static. This is a story about my husband, Victor, who built the system that decided which pilot got assigned to which ship, and about a container vessel called the Nordheim Star, and a morning when his system's math left the one variable it couldn't measure sitting directly in the path of 6,000 containers and 22 crew members. The Port of Alden Sound brought Channel Sync online 3 years ago, an AI-driven vessel traffic and pilot assignment platform built to optimize turnaround times across the port's 41 weekly deep draft transits, balancing pilot availability, tidal windows, vessel draft, and berth scheduling into a single automated rotation. Before Channel Sync, pilot assignments had run on a manual rotation board in the pilot station office, a system that worked but left real inefficiency on the table, ships occasionally waiting hours past optimal tide for a pilot who happened to be next in a strict rotation regardless of that vessel's specific draft or route. Victor led the Port Authority's Digital Operations Division, the job that had brought him to Alden Sound 8 years earlier and, not incidentally, the job through which we'd met, at a stakeholder meeting where I'd been the only working pilot in a room full of engineers and consultants asking pointed questions about a system that, at the time, existed only as a proposal on a slide. I remember him afterward, in the parking lot, asking if I'd be willing to walk him through the bar in person sometime, and I remember thinking, at the time, that it was either the best or the worst pickup line I'd ever heard from someone whose entire job was about to reshape mine. Channel Sync assigns by license tier and rest hour compliance first, Elena, he told me, the week the system reached full deployment across the port's pilot rotation, then optimizes the remainder against tide windows and berth availability. Every pilot on the roster is fully licensed for every vessel class transiting this bar. The system isn't cutting corners on qualification, it's removing the inefficiency of a rigid rotation that doesn't account for what's actually optimal on a given day. Licensed is one thing, Victor. Knowing this particular bar, on this particular week, after this particular dredging cycle, is a different thing entirely, and it's not something a license tier captures. I want to be fair to what Channel Sync actually got right, because this isn't a story about a badly built system. Its optimization across berth scheduling and tidal windows genuinely did reduce average transit delays across the port by a significant margin in its first 18 months, and Victor had built his career on exactly this kind of careful, defensible engineering. I want that clearly on the record before I describe the gap in it, because the gap wasn't carelessness. What it didn't have, and what nobody building it had fully understood the necessity of capturing, was any way to measure the specific, accumulated, personal knowledge one particular pilot might hold about one particular stretch of shifting riverbed that the official survey cycle hadn't yet caught up to. I remember the evening he first walked me through Channel Sync's full assignment logic, spreading a tablet across our kitchen counter the way he did with every major system he'd built across his career, watching him explain optimization weights and rest hour compliance windows with the same patient enthusiasm he'd once used explaining harbor economics to me on our second date. Years before either of us had any reason to think our marriage would eventually include arguing about a sandbar over dinner. I need to explain the specific hazard this story turns on, because it's the actual center of everything that happened, and because it's exactly the kind of narrow, accumulated, personal knowledge and optimization system built around license tiers and scheduling efficiency was never designed to individually account for. I've tried to explain this to people who've never brought a ship across a shifting bar, and I've never found language that fully captures what it means to know, in your hands and your gut, that the channel a chart shows you is already 6 weeks out of date. The Kestrel River bar sits at the mouth of a river carrying a heavy, shifting sediment load, particularly after the seasonal snowmelt runoff that had been unusually heavy the spring before this story's events. Official hydrographic surveys of the bar ran on an 18-month cycle, adequate under most conditions, but this particular season, an unusually aggressive sediment shift had begun pushing the deep water channel's true centerline nearly 40 yards north of where the last official survey had charted it. A drift I'd personally been tracking through my own hand-taken soundings on every transit I'd piloted across that stretch for the past 6 weeks, recording depths in the margin of my own notebook because the official chart update wouldn't post for another 5 months. Channel Sync had no way to ingest that kind of informal, individually held data. It optimized every pilot assignment against the same official chart every other pilot and every port authority system referenced, a chart that was, at that specific moment, wrong about a critical channel centerline by a margin that mattered enormously to a fully loaded, deep draft container vessel and mattered considerably less to a smaller, shallower draft vessel that could tolerate the same drift without real risk. I'd raised this specific gap with Victor nearly 2 months before this story's events, after I'd nearly grounded a fully loaded tanker myself, correcting my approach at the last possible moment purely off my own notebook soundings rather than the chart Channel Sync's briefing packet had handed me that morning. I remember sitting across from him in his office after that transit, both of us shaken in different directions, him needing something more concrete than a working pilot's personal notebook to justify updating a chart reference mid-cycle, and me having nothing but that notebook and 17 years of reading this exact river to offer him. The chart still within its official survey window, Elena. I understand you're tracking a drift informally, and I believe you're seeing something real, but I can't have the Port Authority override a certified hydrographic survey based on one pilot's personal notes without a documented resurvey behind it. I want an interim resurvey of that stretch, Victor. A drift like this doesn't wait politely for an 18-month cycle to catch up to it. That's a Coast Guard and Army Corps coordination request, not something I can order unilaterally. I'll flag it as urgent through the proper channel, but I can't manufacture a resurvey out of an argument alone. The notebook itself was nothing remarkable to look at, a waterproof field logbook I'd carried through 3 previous editions across 17 years, each one filled with depth readings, current notes, and a small personal shorthand I'd developed for describing exactly how a particular stretch of river felt on a given tide, details no official chart had ever asked me to record and no official chart would have known what to do with if I'd offered them. My predecessor, the pilot who trained me when I first came up through the ranks, had kept an identical habit across his own 31 years on the bar, and I remembered him telling me once, half joking, that a chart was a photograph and a river was a movie, and no photograph, however recent, ever quite caught up to what the movie was doing by the time you needed it to. I hadn't fully understood what he meant until my own 6 weeks of sounding started drifting steadily north of the official line, one small increment at a time, each individually forgettable and cumulatively impossible to ignore. The morning this story turns on was the 2nd week of April. An inbound container vessel called the Nordheim Star, fully loaded, 6,000 containers, requiring the deepest draft clearance the bar could safely accommodate on that day's tide. Channel Sync flagged the transit for priority scheduling given a narrow tidal window and the vessel's tight berth commitment downstream, generating an automated pilot assignment that, per the system's rotation logic and rest hour compliance, went to a colleague of mine named Foster, fully licensed, entirely competent. And 6 weeks into his own assignment rotation without a single transit across that specific drifted stretch of channel since the sediment shift had begun accelerating. I was at the pilot station that morning, reviewing the day's transit board, when I saw the Nordheim Star's assignment and felt a very specific, familiar unease, because I'd piloted that exact drifted stretch 11 times in the previous 6 weeks and Foster, as far as I knew, had piloted it 0. Channel Sync's rotation logic had no way to weight that specific difference. Both of us carried identical license tiers, identical rest hour compliance, and by the system's own optimization math, either of us represented an equally valid assignment for a fully loaded deep draft transit across a bar the chart still described as unchanged. I called Victor directly, aware he was already at the Port Operations Center that morning, coordinating the Nordheim Star's tight berth window downstream. Victor, Channel Sync's assigned Foster to the Nordheim Star, and he hasn't crossed that drifted stretch once in 6 weeks. I have, 11 times. The tide window's already tight. If he takes the chart centerline instead of the actual one, a ship that size could ground on a shoal that isn't even on the chart yet. Elena, Foster's fully qualified, the system assigned him correctly by every metric it tracks, and swapping pilots 40 minutes before a priority transit creates its own scheduling risk downstream. I need something more concrete than, "I've crossed it more recently," if you want me to override an assignment this close to departure. I want to describe what I actually did next, because it fell partly within my formal authority as a licensed bar pilot and partly, honestly, outside the specific protocol the pilot station normally followed. Under our Pilots Association bylaws, any licensed pilot held standing authority to request a peer consultation before a transit they assessed as carrying elevated risk, regardless of channel sync's assignment, an authority written into our bylaws specifically to preserve exactly this kind of professional override. What I didn't have was any instrument survey to back my assessment beyond 6 weeks of my own hand-recorded soundings and 17 years of reading this exact river. I drove down to the pilot boat dock myself, radioed Foster directly before he boarded the launch out to the Nordheim Star, and asked him, as a peer consultation rather than a chain of command order, whether he'd be willing to let me walk him through my notebook soundings before he committed to the transit, a request that added roughly 15 minutes to the morning's tight schedule and that I'd made perhaps half a dozen times across 17 years, specifically on transits that felt exactly like this one. Foster met me on the dock, and I spread the notebook open on the hood of my truck, showing him 11 separate depth readings taken across 6 weeks, each one drifting the true centerline a little further north of the official chart's marked channel, a pattern that, laid out together like that, was impossible to read as anything but a real and accelerating shift. I watched his expression change as he traced the pattern with his own finger, the particular sobering recognition of a pilot realizing that the chart briefing in his hand described a river that had, in the specific and important sense, already moved out from under it. "I've got the tide window and the vessel's draft memorized, Elena, but I've genuinely never crossed this stretch since the shift you're describing," he said. "I trust these numbers more than I trust the chart right now, honestly. I'll adjust my approach line north off your soundings, and if the launch captain's willing, I'd rather have you aboard as a second set of eyes for this one." I radioed the launch captain, requested a 2-pilot transit given the elevated risk assessment, a request within both of our professional authority to make jointly, and boarded the pilot launch alongside Foster 20 minutes later, my notebook still open in my jacket pocket, hand-drawn arrows marking exactly how far north of the chart centerline the true channel had drifted. The Nordheim Star loomed enormous as our launch approached her, 6,000 containers stacked above a waterline riding low and heavy with the deepest draft the tide window could safely accommodate. Foster took the con as senior pilot of record, exactly per protocol, but adjusted his approach line the moment we cleared the outer buoy, angling the vessel's bow a full 40 yards north of the chart's marked centerline, precisely matching the drift my notebook had documented across 11 separate transits. I stood beside him on the bridge wing, calling depth readings off my own handheld sounder as a cross-check against the ship's own instruments, watching the numbers hold steady and safe along the corrected line, watching what would have been the chart's official centerline show up on our sounder as nearly 4 feet shallower than the vessel's draft required, a margin that, on a fully loaded deep draft transit, would have meant the Nordheim Star's hull dragging directly across an uncharted shoal. At the worst possible moment of the crossing, 4 feet under keel clearance on the old centerline, Foster. We'd have felt that within the next 90 seconds if you'd held the chart's line instead of mine. I kept my voice level, the particular flat calm I'd trained myself into across 17 years of exactly this kind of moment, even as my pulse was doing something considerably less calm beneath it. Foster held the corrected line steady through the remainder of the crossing, the Nordheim Star clearing the bar with nearly 9 feet of margin along the drifted true channel, a transit that, from the bridge, looked entirely uneventful to anyone aboard who hadn't spent the last 40 minutes watching 2 pilots quietly correct for a gap in the chart that the ship's own captain never learned existed until Foster briefed him, calmly, once we'd cleared into the deeper water of the inner harbor. Victor met the launch himself at the pilot station dock that afternoon, having pulled the Nordheim Star's transit log and cross-referenced it against Channel Sync's original chart-based routing the moment word reached the operations center that Foster had crossed the bar on a corrected line rather than the system's assigned one. I want to describe the conversation honestly, because it wasn't simple vindication for either of us, even with hard-sounding data finally sitting in front of both our eyes. 4 feet of clearance difference on a fully loaded deep draft transit, Elena. That's not a marginal discrepancy, that's the difference between a routine crossing and a grounded container ship blocking the channel for a week. I've been logging that drift for 6 weeks, Victor. I didn't have anything beyond my own notebook to prove it until this morning, because a hand sounder and 17 years of pattern recognition aren't the kind of evidence your system's built to weigh against a certified survey. Which is exactly the gap I need to close, and I know that now in a way I didn't fully let myself believe 2 months ago, when you first raised it. I wasn't dismissing you out of stubbornness, I genuinely didn't have anything the system, or the Coast Guard survey cycle, could act on until Foster's transit made the gap impossible to keep deferring. I know that, Victor. I'm not angry at you for needing more than a personal notebook before overriding a certified survey. I'm telling you that the one time it mattered, the gap between what the chart said and what the river was actually doing would have put a 22-person crew and a fully loaded vessel directly on a shoal neither channel sink nor the official survey knew existed yet. He was quiet for a long moment, looking past me at the Nordheim Star's containers now visible stacked at her downstream berth, and I watched him run the same calculation I imagined he'd been running since the moment the transit log crossed his desk, the particular engineer's math of how many other transits, across 3 years and 41 weekly crossings, might have carried the same invisible gap without a working pilot happening to keep her own soundings closely enough to catch it in time. I keep thinking about the version of this morning where you weren't standing at the transit board when Foster's assignment posted, he said, finally, or the version where you'd let it go after I pushed back the first time, because I outranked the argument on paper if not in the water. I don't like sitting with how much of this morning came down to you personally deciding not to drop it. I don't love sitting with that either, Victor. A system this good shouldn't need one stubborn pilot's notebook as its last line of defense. That's not a compliment to me, it's a description of exactly the gap we both need to close. What we built together over the following weeks, working with the Coast Guard and the Port Authority both, was an emergency interim resurvey of the drifted stretch, expedited well outside the normal 18-month cycle, along with a standing protocol allowing any pilot's personally logged soundings to trigger a mandatory peer consultation flag inside channel sync itself whenever a transit's assigned pilot hadn't crossed a given stretch within the preceding 30 days, closing the exact blind spot that had let 3 years of otherwise excellent scheduling optimization miss a drift real enough to nearly ground a container ship. The Kestrel River Bar's official chart updated 6 weeks later, once the emergency resurvey cleared review, the corrected centerline matching my notebook soundings within a margin of inches, vindication that felt considerably less satisfying, in the moment, than simply watching Foster and the Nordheim Star clear the bar safely that April morning had felt. I still keep the notebook, though the Port Authority's insurers now require every bar pilot to log formal digital soundings after each transit, feeding directly into Channel Sync's assignment weighting, a change that's made my particular ritual considerably less singular than it used to be, and considerably more useful to every pilot on the rotation rather than just the one stubborn enough to have kept it going alone for 6 years. Foster still thanks me, occasionally, over coffee at the pilot station, for a 15-minute delay on a dock that neither of us has ever needed to explain twice to anyone who's since heard the full story. Victor and I talk about Channel Sync's ongoing refinement most evenings now, over dinner, the same way we've talked shop for years, except the conversation carries a specific new weight neither of us fully had before that April morning. He told me, once, that the hardest part of the whole episode wasn't the engineering fix at all, it was sitting with how confidently 3 years of clean optimization data had let him believe a rigid licensed tier rotation was fundamentally sound, right up until a 15-minute dockside consultation his own wife insisted on finally made the gap impossible to keep deferring. A chart tells you where a channel was, not necessarily where it is on the particular morning you're crossing it. What I've learned, watching a system built by someone I love get this one thing wrong for 3 years before finally getting it right, is that the rarest, most personally held knowledge is often exactly the kind of good system, optimizing against everything it knows how to formally measure, will keep missing longest, simply because a notebook in one pilot's jacket pocket was never designed to be the kind of data a system knows how to ask for. It took a drifting sandbar, a 15-minute dockside conversation, and a marriage built on enough trust to argue honestly across a kitchen counter, to finally close a gap that 3 years of otherwise excellent engineering had never quite found its way to on its own.